What happens when society's cruelest labels become your greatest motivation? Whenever you can't becomes fuel for watch me. This is the story of a woman who transformed mockery into might, tears into triumph, and proved that sometimes the most devastating defeats create the most unstoppable warriors. They called her princess. They laughed at her tears. They never imagined she would return as their worst nightmare. Not in a dress and tiara, but in combat boots and body armor, ready to outfight, outthink, and outperform every single person who ever doubted her strength. This isn't just another underdog story. This is about the moment when someone decides that being underestimated isn't a weakness, it's a weapon. And sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone dismissed as too soft to fight back. Get ready to witness what happens when a princess becomes a predator. The gymnasium echoed with the harsh sound of combat boots on polished floors and the rhythmic slap of bodies hitting training mats. Sweat mixed with determination filled the air as Marine recruits pushed their bodies beyond what they thought possible. But in the corner of the massive training facility, something different was happening. Something that would change everything. Sarah Martinez stood frozen as 6 Marines surrounded her, their faces twisted with cruel amusement. She had just finished her physical training test, her muscles screaming from the effort, her lungs burning from exertion. Her performance had been decent, not outstanding, but decent enough to pass the requirements for the military preparatory program she had joined after high school. She thought she was making progress. She thought she was proving herself. She was wrong. "Look at Princess here," sneered Corporal Johnson, a man whose reputation for breaking new recruits was legendary on the base. His voice carried across the training area, causing other soldiers to turn and watch. Thought she could play soldier with the big boys. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, not from pain, but from the crushing weight of humiliation. She had worked so hard to get to this point. Months of preparation, countless hours of studying military protocols, physical conditioning that had pushed her body to its limits. Her father, a retired Army sergeant, had warned her that military life would test her in ways she couldn't imagine. But nothing had prepared her for this moment of public degradation. "Go ahead, cry, princess," laughed Sergeant Williams, his voice dripping with contempt. The other Marines joined in, their laughter creating a wall of mockery that seemed to close in around her. "Maybe you should go back to your dollhouse where you belong." The tears came then, hot and bitter, streaming down her face as she stood there paralyzed. Every insult felt like a physical blow. Every laugh cut deeper than any training exercise had. She wanted to fight back, to prove them wrong, but her voice seemed to have abandoned her. Her body, which had just completed a grueling workout, now felt weak and small under their harsh stares. "Look at that," mocked Private Rodriguez, pointing at her tears. "Can't even handle a little criticism without falling apart. This is what happens when they let girls think they can do a man's job." The crowd of observers grew larger. Other recruits, instructors, even some visiting officers stopped to watch the spectacle. Sarah felt exposed, vulnerable, like an animal in a zoo being studied by visitors. Some faces showed sympathy, but most displayed the same cruel amusement as her tormentors. The military, she was learning, could be a brutal place for those perceived as weak. "I bet she calls her mommy tonight," Johnson continued, his voice growing louder and more theatrical, crying about how the mean soldiers were bullying her. Poor little princess can't cut it in the real world. Sarah's mind raced with responses she wanted to give. She wanted to tell them about the hours she had spent preparing for this moment, about the sacrifices she had made to even get the opportunity to be here, about her dreams of serving her country with honor and distinction. But the words wouldn't come. The humiliation was too overwhelming, the public nature of the attack too devastating. The laughter continued, each burst feeling like another nail in the coffin of her military aspirations. She looked around desperately for someone to intervene, for an instructor to step in and restore order. But the hierarchy of the military meant that lower-ranking individuals like herself had little recourse when faced with this kind of treatment from superior ranks. "Maybe we should get her some tissues," Williams suggested with mock concern. "And perhaps a nice cup of tea. Isn't that what princesses drink when they're upset?" The comment triggered another wave of laughter from the gathered soldiers. Sarah felt her face burning with shame. She had never experienced anything like this level of public humiliation. In civilian life, there had been bullies and mean comments, but nothing that compared to this systematic demolition of her character in front of an audience of her peers and superiors. One of the observers, a female officer Sarah didn't recognize, stepped forward. For a moment, hope flared in Sarah's chest that someone would finally put an end to this torture. Instead, the officer simply shook her head with disappointment. "This is why integration remains such a challenge," the officer said quietly to her companion. "Some people simply aren't built for military service." The comment, meant to be private, carried clearly to Sarah's ears. It felt like the final blow, the official confirmation that she didn't belong here, that all her dreams and aspirations were nothing more than naive fantasies. Johnson noticed the officer's comment and seized on it. "You hear that, princess? Even the female officers think you're a joke. Maybe it's time to face reality and find a career more suited to your delicate sensibilities." Sarah's vision blurred with tears, but through them, she could see the faces surrounding her clearly. Each expression of amusement, contempt, or indifference burned itself into her memory. These faces would haunt her dreams and fuel her nightmares for months to come. But they would also serve another purpose, one that none of these Marines could imagine in that moment. The group began to disperse as the novelty of tormenting Sarah wore off. They had other training to complete, other recruits to intimidate, other tasks that demanded their attention. But Johnson lingered, apparently not quite finished with his entertainment. "Here's some free advice, princess," he said, his voice now taking on a false tone of helpfulness. "Military service isn't a game. It's not something you do to prove a point or make a statement about female empowerment. It's serious business that requires serious people. People who don't cry when things get tough." Sarah found her voice finally, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I'm not trying to make a statement. I just want to serve. Want to serve." Johnson laughed, but this time it was a cold, humorless sound. "Princess, you can't even serve yourself up for basic training without falling apart. How do you think you'd handle real combat? Real pressure? Real responsibility for other people's lives?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah had no answer because, in that moment, she couldn't imagine how she would handle those things. The confidence she had felt just hours earlier seemed like a distant memory. The woman who had walked into this training facility with dreams of military glory felt like a stranger. "I thought so," Johnson said when she didn't respond. He turned to walk away, then paused for one final blow. "Do yourself and everyone else a favor, princess. Find a nice desk job somewhere safe and comfortable. Leave the real work to real warriors." As the last of the Marines walked away, Sarah stood alone in the corner of the training facility, her tears finally beginning to slow. The building, which had seemed so full of promise and opportunity just hours earlier, now felt like a monument to her failure. Every piece of equipment, every motivational poster on the walls, every flag hanging from the rafters seemed to mock her presence. She wanted to run. Every instinct told her to grab her gear, walk out of this place, and never look back. To pretend this had never happened, and find some way to rebuild her shattered confidence in a different environment. The path of least resistance beckoned to her like a siren's song. But something deeper, something that even the humiliation couldn't quite reach, began to stir within her. It started as a tiny flame of anger, barely noticeable among the overwhelming emotions of shame and hurt. But as she stood there alone, replaying every cruel word, every mocking laugh, every dismissive look, that flame began to grow. They had called her princess. They had laughed at her tears. They had dismissed her as too weak, too soft, too feminine for military service. They had made their judgment of her based on a single moment of vulnerability, a single display of human emotion. But they didn't know her. They didn't know about the steel that ran through her veins, inherited from generations of fighters who had never backed down from a challenge. They didn't know about the determination that had driven her to excel in everything she had ever attempted. They didn't know about the dreams that had brought her to this place. Dreams that wouldn't die just because some bullies had tried to kill them. Most importantly, they didn't know that they had just made the biggest mistake of their military careers. They had underestimated Sarah Martinez, and that underestimation would become their downfall. As she finally wiped the last tears from her face and walked out of that training facility, Sarah made a promise to herself. A promise that would reshape her life and redefine what it meant to be strong. She would return to this place, but not as the broken woman who was leaving. She would return as something these Marines had never encountered before. She would return as their worst nightmare. The journey that began with cruel laughter and the label princess was about to transform into something none of them could imagine. Sarah Martinez was about to become a force of nature, and when she was finished, every person who had witnessed her humiliation would understand that they had been looking at the future of military excellence. They just didn't know it yet. The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 in the morning, but Sarah Martinez was already awake. She had been staring at the ceiling for the past hour, her mind running through the training regimen she had created for herself. 6 months had passed since that devastating day in the Marine training facility, and every single morning had begun the same way. Before dawn, before the world stirred to life, before anyone else was ready to face the day. She rolled out of bed and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back bore little resemblance to the broken recruit who had fled that gymnasium in tears. Her body had transformed through months of relentless training. Muscles defined themselves clearly under her skin, speaking to countless hours of weightlifting, running, swimming, and combat conditioning. But the most dramatic change wasn't physical. Her eyes held a different fire now. Where once there had been uncertainty and hope for acceptance, now there was cold determination and absolute focus. The tears were gone, replaced by a steely resolve that had been forged in the furnace of humiliation and tempered by months of single-minded dedication. Sarah pulled on her running gear and stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The streets were empty except for the occasional late-night worker heading home or early morning jogger beginning their day. She preferred this time, when the world belonged to her alone, when she could push her body and mind without distractions or observers. Her route took her through the hills surrounding her hometown, a challenging path that included steep inclines, rocky terrain, and sections that would challenge even experienced trail runners. When she had first attempted this route 6 months ago, she had barely made it halfway before exhaustion forced her to walk home in defeat. Now, she completed it twice each morning before most people had their first cup of coffee. As her feet found their rhythm on the familiar path, her mind wandered back to the research that had consumed her life since that terrible day. She had spent countless hours studying different branches of the military, analyzing training programs, and identifying the most challenging paths to military service. The Marines had rejected her, but that rejection had opened her eyes to possibilities she had never considered. The Navy SEALs represented the pinnacle of military training and operational excellence. Their selection process was legendary for its difficulty, with failure rates that eliminated over 80% of candidates. The physical demands were extreme, the mental challenges brutal, and the standards uncompromising. Most importantly, very few women had ever even attempted SEAL training, and fewer still had succeeded. It was perfect. Sarah had contacted every SEAL training facility, every former SEAL she could locate, and every expert who could provide insight into what it would take to not just survive but excel in their program. The responses had been uniformly discouraging. Most had politely suggested she consider other military careers more suited to her gender and physical limitations. Some had been more direct in their skepticism, but one response had been different. Master Chief Petty Officer Rebecca Thompson, one of the first women to complete specialized naval combat training, had agreed to meet with Sarah. The conversation that followed had changed everything. "You want to be a SEAL," Thompson had said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Do you know what that means?" Sarah had nodded eagerly, ready to recite the research she had compiled about SEAL training and operations. But Thompson had held up a hand to stop her. "Forget everything you've read," Thompson had said firmly. "Books and Articles can tell you about the training, but they can't tell you about what it feels like when your body is shutting down and your mind is screaming at you to quit, but you have to keep going anyway. They can't tell you about the moment when every instinct you have is telling you that you're going to die, but you have to trust your training and your team instead of your fear. The older woman had studied Sarah carefully, her eyes seeming to peer directly into her soul. Why you want this? And don't give me some patriotic speech about serving your country. Every recruit has noble motivations. I want to know what's really driving you. Sarah had told her about the Marines, about the humiliation, about the label of princess that had been burned into her memory. She expected Thompson to dismiss her motivations as petty or misguided. Instead, the Master Chief had smiled for the first time since their conversation began. Good, Thompson had said simply. Anger is fuel if you know how to use it. But it's not enough by itself. You need to transform that anger into something bigger, something that will sustain you when the anger isn't enough anymore. That conversation had led to the most intensive training regimen Sarah had ever imagined. Thompson had introduced her to former SEALs who were willing to help prepare her, to specialized trainers who could push her body to its absolute limits, and to mental conditioning experts who could strengthen her psychological resilience. The physical transformation had been dramatic, but it was only the beginning. Sarah had learned advanced swimming techniques that allowed her to move through water like a marine predator. She had studied hand-to-hand combat systems that incorporated techniques from multiple martial arts disciplines. She had practiced with weapons until field stripping and reassembling them became as natural as breathing. But the mental training had been even more intense. Hours of meditation to develop unshakable focus. Stress conditioning that exposed her to increasingly difficult scenarios while maintaining peak performance. Psychological preparation for the isolation, pressure, and constant evaluation that defined SEAL training. As Sarah crested the highest hill on her morning route, she could see the sun beginning to rise over the horizon. The view was spectacular, but she barely noticed it. Her mind was focused on the letter that had arrived yesterday, the letter that would determine whether months of preparation had been successful. Her application to Navy SEAL training had been accepted. The notification had been brief and formal, providing details about reporting dates, initial requirements, and preliminary instructions. But those few paragraphs represented the culmination of everything she had worked towards since that devastating day with the Marines. Sarah increased her pace for the descent, her legs pumping like pistons as she navigated the steep, winding path. Her breathing remained controlled and steady despite the increased intensity. Months of high-altitude training and cardiovascular conditioning had given her lung capacity and endurance that surpassed most professional athletes. When she arrived back at her apartment, she found Thompson waiting for her with coffee and what appeared to be a serious expression. The Master Chief had become something between a mentor and a surrogate military parent over the past months, providing guidance, motivation, and occasionally brutal honesty about Sarah's progress and prospects. Congratulations, Thompson said, holding up a copy of the acceptance letter. You're officially headed to SEAL training. How do you feel? Sarah considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, she would have been ecstatic, probably crying tears of joy and relief. But the woman she had become didn't operate on such simple emotions anymore. Ready, she said simply. Thompson nodded approvingly. Good answer. Because the real work is just beginning. Everything you've done up to this point has been preparation for preparation. SEAL training will test every improvement you've made and find weaknesses you didn't know you had. The older woman set down her coffee and fixed Sarah with a serious stare. I need to ask you something, and I need complete honesty. Are you doing this to prove something to those Marines who humiliated you? Or are you doing this to become the best military operator you can possibly be? The question hung in the air between them. Sarah knew it was important, possibly the most important question she would face before beginning SEAL training. Her answer would reveal whether she had truly transformed her motivation or was still driven primarily by the need for revenge. Both, she said finally. I want to prove them wrong, but I also want to become something they never imagined possible. I want to be so good at what I do that their opinion becomes irrelevant. Thompson smiled, an expression of genuine pride and satisfaction. That's the right answer. Revenge is a good motivator, but excellence is a better goal. Keep that balance, and you might actually survive what's coming. Over the next hour, Thompson walked Sarah through final preparations for SEAL training. The physical requirements were extreme, but Sarah had been exceeding those standards for months. The mental challenges would be intense, but her conditioning had prepared her for psychological pressure that would break most people. More importantly, Thompson explained the culture Sarah would be entering. SEAL training was notorious for its brutal evaluation of character, determination, and mental toughness. Instructors were trained to identify weakness and exploit it mercilessly. Many candidates who were physically prepared still failed because they couldn't handle the psychological assault. They're going to try to break you, Thompson warned. Not because they don't want you to succeed, but because they need to know you won't break under real operational pressure. When you're in enemy territory with your team's life, depending on your performance, there's no room for self-doubt or emotional vulnerability. Sarah nodded, understanding the logic even as she felt a familiar chill of anticipation. The woman who had cried in front of those Marines was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to use pressure and adversity as fuel for achievement. As Thompson prepared to leave, she turned back with one final piece of advice. Remember why you're really doing this. Not for revenge, not to prove a point, but to become the warrior you were always meant to be. Those Marines who mocked you gave you a gift, even though they didn't mean to. They showed you what you were capable of becoming when someone told you that you couldn't. That evening, Sarah stood in her apartment, surrounded by the gear and equipment she would take to SEAL training. Months of preparation had led to this moment, and tomorrow she would begin the journey that would either transform her into one of the world's most elite military operators or break her completely. She thought about those Marines one more time, remembering their cruel laughter and dismissive comments. They had called her princess, had mocked her tears, had told her she was too weak for military service. In just a few weeks, she would find out if they were right. But deep in her heart, she already knew the answer. The woman they had broken no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had learned to transform pain into power, humiliation into determination, and tears into an unbreakable will to succeed. The princess was dead. What emerged from her ashes would be something far more dangerous than any of those Marines could comprehend. The Pacific Ocean felt like liquid ice as Sarah Martinez plunged into the surf for what seemed like the 100th time that day. Her body had long since stopped registering the cold as pain and had moved into a state of numb acceptance. Around her, other SEAL candidates struggled through the same torture, their faces masks of determination and exhaustion. This was Hell Week, the legendary 5.5 days of continuous training that broke more SEAL candidates than any other part of the program. Sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and mental pressure combined into a relentless assault designed to identify those with the unbreakable will necessary for special operations. 3 months had passed since Sarah arrived at Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Coronado, California. The journey to this moment had been a brutal education in what it truly meant to pursue excellence at the highest levels of military service. Every assumption she had made about her preparedness had been systematically demolished and rebuilt from the ground up. The first day had been a shock that nearly sent her home immediately. Despite months of intensive preparation, she had quickly discovered that SEAL training existed in a category of difficulty that no amount of civilian preparation could fully anticipate. The physical requirements were extreme, but manageable for someone with her conditioning. The real challenge was the relentless psychological pressure applied by instructors who seemed determined to find her breaking point. Martinez, Chief Petty Officer Jackson's voice cut through the sound of crashing waves and labored breathing. Jackson had become Sarah's primary tormentor, a man who seemed to take personal pleasure in pushing her beyond what should have been humanly possible. You think this is hard? This is the easy part. Wait until we get serious. Sarah forced herself to stand straighter, to meet Jackson's stare with unwavering eye contact. She had learned early that showing weakness or uncertainty only invited more punishment. The instructors respected strength and determination even when they were trying their best to destroy both qualities. "But yeah, Chief," she responded with a crisp acknowledgement that had become second nature. Jackson studied her for a moment, looking for signs of the breakdown he had been predicting since her arrival. Many instructors had made it clear they expected her to quit, not because they were opposed to women in special operations, but because the statistical reality was that very few people of any gender could complete this program. "Drop and give me 50, Jackson ordered. "Then, join your boat crew for log PT." Sarah dropped to the sand without hesitation, her body moving into push-up position with mechanical precision. 50 push-ups after hours of continuous exercise should have been impossible, but months of conditioning had taught her that impossible was just another word for haven't tried hard enough yet. As she completed the push-ups, her mind wandered to the letter she had received from Master Chief Thompson just days before Hell Week began. The message had been brief, but powerful. "Remember that every person who has ever completed this training was once exactly where you are now. The only difference between success and failure is refusing to quit when quitting seems like the only rational choice." Those words had sustained Sarah through the darkest moments of the past 3 days. When her body screamed for rest that wouldn't come. When her mind begged for relief from the constant pressure and evaluation. When instructors told her she was weak, inadequate, and destined for failure. She finished the push-ups and ran toward her boat crew, a group of 7 other candidates who had become her military family over the past months. These men had started as strangers, some openly skeptical about training alongside a woman. But weeks of shared suffering had created bonds that transcended gender, background, or any other superficial differences. "About time," Martinez grinned Petty Officer Williams, one of her boat crew partners. Despite his joking tone, his eyes showed the same exhaustion that plagued everyone during Hell Week. "We were starting to think Jackson finally broke you." "Not even close," Sarah replied, grabbing her position on the heavy wooden log that served as their primary torture device during physical training. The log weighed several hundred pounds and required perfect coordination between all 8 crew members to lift, carry, and maneuver through various obstacles. For the next hour, they carried the log through sand dunes, into the ocean over obstacles, and through courses designed to test not just physical strength, but mental coordination under extreme stress. Sarah's position required her to bear significant weight while maintaining communication with her teammates and following complex movement patterns. During one particularly challenging sequence, Williams stumbled and nearly dropped his end of the log. The mistake would have resulted in punishment for the entire crew, but Sarah instinctively adjusted her grip and leverage to compensate, preventing a disaster that could have added hours to their already brutal day. "Nice save," whispered Jackson, one of the other crew members. "That was some serious strength." The comment meant more to Sarah than any official commendation could have. Respect from her fellow candidates, earned through performance under pressure, represented validation that no instructor's approval could match. These men had seen her at her worst and best, had witnessed her struggle and succeed, and had accepted her as a fully contributing member of their team. As Hell Week progressed, Sarah found herself entering a mental state she had never experienced before. The combination of sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and constant stress created a condition where normal psychological defenses simply stopped functioning. But instead of breaking her, this state revealed reserves of strength and determination she hadn't known existed. During the 4th day, when many candidates traditionally quit, Sarah faced her own moment of crisis. The boat crew was attempting to navigate their craft through heavy surf while instructors screamed contradictory orders and applied additional stress through various forms of harassment. The situation was chaotic, dangerous, and seemingly impossible to complete successfully. Sarah's body was shutting down, her muscles cramped with fatigue, her vision blurred from exhaustion, and her mind struggled to process the complex instructions being shouted at her from multiple directions. For a moment that felt like an eternity, she considered simply stopping, raising her hand, and ringing the bell that would end her SEAL training forever. In that moment of crisis, she remembered something Thompson had told her months earlier. The moment when you want to quit most desperately is the moment that defines whether you become a SEAL or remain a candidate. Everyone reaches that point. The difference is what you do when you get there. Instead of quitting, Sarah forced herself to focus on her immediate task. She blocked out the screaming instructors, ignored her body's protests, and concentrated on executing her role in the boat crew with mechanical precision. Step by step, stroke by stroke, she pushed through the crisis and emerged on the other side with renewed determination. Jackson, who had been watching her struggle, approached as the exercise concluded. His expression was unreadable, but there was something different in his eyes, something that might have been respect. "That was your moment, Martinez," he said quietly. "The moment when you had to choose between comfort and commitment. You chose commitment. Remember that feeling, because you're going to need it again." The final day of Hell Week arrived with a mixture of relief and trepidation. Candidates who had survived this far knew they had accomplished something extraordinary, but they also understood that graduation was still far from guaranteed. The weeks following Hell Week would bring new challenges, different forms of testing, and additional opportunities for failure. As Sarah completed the final exercises of Hell Week, she felt a transformation that went deeper than physical conditioning or mental toughness. She had discovered something about herself that the Marines who had mocked her could never have imagined. Under extreme pressure, when everything seemed impossible, she didn't break. She adapted, overcame, and emerged stronger. The graduation ceremony for Hell Week was brief, but meaningful. Of the original class of over 200 candidates, fewer than 50 remained. The attrition rate was typical for SEAL training, but each person who quit represented dreams deferred and potential unrealized. Chief Jackson called Sarah aside after the ceremony. The man who had been her primary tormentor for months looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. "Martinez, I've been training SEAL candidates for 15 years, he said. "I've seen strong men break down crying, tough guys quit because they missed their mothers, and athletes who thought they were invincible discover they weren't even close. You want to know what I've learned in all that time?" Sarah waited, uncertain where this conversation was heading. "The people who succeed aren't necessarily the strongest or the fastest or even the smartest," Jackson continued. "They're the ones who refuse to accept failure as an option. They're the ones who find ways to keep going when every rational part of their brain is telling them to stop. You've got that quality, and it's rarer than you might think." The words were more validation than Sarah had ever expected to receive from Jackson. But, more importantly, they confirmed what she had discovered about herself during the crucible of Hell Week. As she prepared for the next phase of training, Sarah thought about those Marines who had humiliated her nearly a year earlier. They had called her princess, had laughed at her tears, had told her she was too weak for military service. If they could see her now, standing among the elite candidates who had survived Hell Week, what would they think? But as the thought crossed her mind, Sarah realized something that surprised her. She no longer cared what those Marines thought. Their opinion had lost its power over her. She wasn't pursuing SEAL training to prove them wrong anymore. She was pursuing it because she had discovered she was capable of excellence at a level that most people never even attempt. The princess they had mocked was truly dead now. In her place stood someone who had been forged in the furnace of the world's most demanding military training. Someone who had looked into the abyss of her own limitations and chosen to push beyond them. Someone who was becoming exactly what those Marines had claimed she could never be, a true warrior. But the journey was far from over. Hell Week was just the beginning, and the most challenging test still lay ahead. Sarah Martinez, the woman who had once cried under the mocking laughter of Marines, was about to discover what she could accomplish when she stopped trying to prove herself to others and started demanding excellence from herself. The real test was yet to come. The desert training facility stretched endlessly in every direction, a barren landscape that seemed designed to test human endurance against nature itself. Sarah Martinez lay motionless in her concealed position, her breathing controlled and silent as she observed the mock enemy compound through her rifle scope. She had been in this position for over 6 hours, waiting for the perfect moment to execute her mission. This was the final phase of SEAL training, where everything learned over the previous 18 months will be tested in realistic combat scenarios. The candidates who had survived Hell Week and the subsequent months of specialized training now faced evaluations that would determine whether they earned the coveted SEAL Trident or joined the ranks of those who had come close, but fallen short of the ultimate goal. Sarah's ghillie suit blended perfectly with the desert terrain, rendering her virtually invisible to the opposing force that patrolled the compound below. The suit itself was a work of art, meticulously constructed over weeks of preparation using local vegetation, fabric strips, and camouflage techniques that transformed her into part of the landscape. Through her earpiece, she heard the whispered communications of her team members positioned at strategic points around the target area. Each voice represented months of shared training, mutual trust, and the kind of bond that could only be forged through surviving the crucible of SEAL preparation together. Shadow 1. This is Shadow 3, came the barely audible transmission from Williams, her boat crew partner from Hell Week, who had become one of her closest teammates. I have eyes on the eastern approach. 2 guards, routine patrol pattern, no deviation from previous cycles. Sarah keyed her microphone with a single, soft click to acknowledge the report. Radio discipline during operations was critical, and unnecessary communication could compromise the entire mission. Every word had to serve a purpose. Every transmission had to provide actionable intelligence. The mission scenario was complex, designed to test not just individual skills, but team coordination under realistic combat conditions. The team had to infiltrate the compound, neutralize specific targets, extract valuable intelligence, and exfiltrate without detection. Failure at any stage would result in mission termination and potentially elimination from the training program. Sarah's role as the team's designated marksman placed enormous pressure on her performance. Her responsibility was to provide overwatch and precision fire support, which meant that her teammates' safety depended on her ability to accurately engage threats at extended ranges while remaining concealed from enemy observation. The irony of her current position wasn't lost on her. 18 months earlier, Marines had mocked her as princess and suggested she find a safe desk job. Now she lay in hostile terrain with a high-precision rifle, preparing to demonstrate skills that those same Marines probably couldn't match on their best day. But the thought brought no satisfaction, no sense of vindication. The woman who had been broken by their cruel words no longer existed. The person who had emerged from the forge of SEAL training was focused entirely on mission success and team performance. Personal validation had become irrelevant in the face of professional excellence. Shadow 1. Target building shows movement, whispered Jackson, her former Hell Week tormentor who had become both teammate and friend during the advanced phases of training. Appears to be shift change in progress. Window opening in approximately 90 seconds. Sarah adjusted her position slightly, ensuring optimal sight lines to the compound while maintaining concealment. Her rifle was a precision instrument, calibrated to her specific shooting characteristics and environmental conditions. Months of marksmanship training had transformed her into a surgeon with long-range weapons, capable of placing shots with accuracy that defied probability. The countdown began in her mind as she tracked the movement patterns below. Timing would be critical. Her teammates needed to breach the compound during the brief window when guard positions were most vulnerable, and her overwatch fire had to be precise enough to neutralize threats without endangering friendlies. Execute, 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 came the command from their team leader, and Sarah watched through her scope as figures in black moved like shadows toward their assigned entry points. The first guard never knew what hit him. Sarah's suppressed rifle coughed quietly, and the figure dropped instantly. Her bolts cycled smoothly as she acquired the second target. Another guard who had noticed something wrong, but hadn't yet identified the threat. Another controlled shot, another clean elimination. Overwatch clear, she transmitted, providing her teammates with the confirmation they needed to proceed with their assault. The next few minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of violence. Sarah provided precision fire support as her team moved through the compound, eliminating obstacles and securing objectives with efficiency that would have impressed veteran special operations units. Every shot she fired found its mark. Every tactical decision proved correct. Every coordination between team members flowed seamlessly. But the exercise was designed to test more than just operational skills. As the team prepared to exfiltrate with their mock intelligence, the scenario suddenly changed. Additional enemy forces appeared, communication systems went down, and planned escape routes became compromised. The test had become a evaluation of adaptability under pressure. Shadow 1, we've got multiple hostiles converging on our position, Jackson transmitted urgently. Primary exfil route is blown. Secondary is crawling with opposition. We need options. Sarah scanned the terrain through her scope, her mind racing through possibilities. The training had prepared her for exactly this type of crisis, where rigid planning had to give way to creative problem-solving under lethal pressure. She identified a potential solution, but it would require exposing herself to significant risk. Shadow 3. Can you suppress the Eastern approach for 30 seconds? She transmitted. Roger that. Williams responded immediately, understanding that Sarah had formulated a plan that would depend on his covering fire. Sarah abandoned her concealed position and began moving across open terrain, using elevation changes and natural cover to mask her movement. Her destination was a ridgeline that would provide optimal firing positions to cover her team's escape, but reaching it required crossing several hundred yards of exposed ground. The next few minutes tested every aspect of her training. Moving under fire while maintaining accuracy, coordinating with teammates through limited communication, and making split-second tactical decisions that could determine mission success or failure. She felt bullets crack past her position as enemy forces tried to target her movement, but her training had taught her to use fear as fuel rather than allowing it to paralyze her performance. From her new position, Sarah could dominate the entire battlefield. Her rifle spoke repeatedly, each shot carefully placed to eliminate threats or force enemies into positions where her teammates could engage them effectively. The precision and speed of her fire turned the tide of the simulated battle, allowing her team to break contact and reach their extraction point. As the exercise concluded and range safety officers called End X, Sarah felt a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction that had become familiar over the months of training. Another test completed, another opportunity to prove that her presence in SEAL training was based on capability rather than political correctness or social experimentation. The debrief that followed was conducted by instructors who had been evaluating every aspect of the team's performance. Their feedback was detailed and professional, highlighting both successes and areas for improvement. But Sarah noticed something in their tone that had been absent during earlier phases of training. They were no longer evaluating her as a curiosity or an experiment. They were treating her as a fully qualified member of an elite military unit. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, representing recognition earned through consistent performance under the most demanding conditions. Martinez called Instructor Chief Rodriguez after the formal debrief concluded. "Walk with me." They moved away from the group, walking along a ridge that overlooked the training area where Sarah had just demonstrated skills that few military personnel would ever develop. Rodriguez was a veteran SEAL with multiple combat deployments, a man whose opinion carried weight throughout the special operations community. "I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you," Rodriguez began. "When you first arrived here, a lot of people had doubts. Not because we don't support women in combat roles, but because SEAL training has a specific purpose. We can't lower standards or make accommodations, because doing so would compromise operational effectiveness and put lives at risk." Sarah listened carefully, unsure where this conversation was heading. "What you've demonstrated over the past 18 months is that gender is irrelevant when someone possesses the right combination of physical capability, mental toughness, and tactical intelligence," Rodriguez continued. "You've earned your place here through performance, not politics. That's how it should be." The words carried more weight than any formal recognition could have provided. This was validation from the special operations community itself, acknowledgement that her journey from humiliated recruit to elite warrior had been completed successfully. "There's something else," Rodriguez added. "We've had inquiries from operational units asking about your availability after graduation. Real teams, with real missions, who want you based on your training performance. That's the highest compliment this community can offer. As they walked back toward the training facility, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a gymnasium where Marines had mocked her tears to the desert where she had just proven her tactical excellence, the transformation had been complete and irreversible. But the most important realization was that she no longer thought about those Marines at all. Their opinion had become irrelevant, their mockery powerless to affect her sense of worth or capability. She had transcended their limited vision of what she could become and had proven something far more important than their judgment wrong. She had proven herself right. The final weeks of SEAL training would bring additional challenges and evaluations, but Sarah knew she had already accomplished the most important victory. She had transformed pain into strength, humiliation into determination, and mockery into motivation for excellence. The princess they had laughed at was gone forever. In her place stood a warrior who had earned her place among the world's elite military operators through merit, determination, and an unbreakable will to succeed. And she was just getting started. The military gymnasium looked exactly the same as it had 2 years earlier, down to the motivational posters on the walls and the familiar smell of sweat and determination. But as Sarah Martinez walked through the doors wearing her Navy SEAL dress uniform with a gleaming trident proudly displayed on her chest, she might as well have been entering a different universe. She was here for a joint training exercise between various military units, an event designed to foster cooperation and share tactical knowledge between different branches of service. It was routine military business, the kind of professional development that filled the calendars of elite operators. But for Sarah, this particular assignment carried a significance that went far beyond standard training protocols. The Marines from that devastating day 2 years ago were here. Sarah had known this moment might come eventually. The military was simultaneously vast and small, bringing together personnel from different units in ways that created inevitable reunions. She had prepared herself psychologically for this encounter, but nothing could have fully prepared her for the emotions that surfaced when she spotted familiar faces across the crowded gymnasium. Corporal Johnson was there, now Sergeant Johnson, conducting equipment inspections with the same authoritative demeanor she remembered. Sergeant Williams had been promoted as well, directing a group of younger Marines through combat drills. The same men who had surrounded her with cruel laughter were now just a few yards away, completely unaware that their former victim had returned. But Sarah was no longer anyone's victim. The transformation was so complete that she moved through the facility like a predator surveying territory. Her bearing, her confidence, her obvious competence marked her as someone who commanded respect in military circles. Other personnel, regardless of branch or rank, gave her the deference automatically accorded to special operations personnel. "Holy shit," whispered one of the Marines, a young private who couldn't have been more than 19. "Is that a female SEAL? I didn't know they existed." His comment carried clearly across the gymnasium, drawing attention to Sarah's presence. Conversations paused as personnel turned to study the woman wearing the most exclusive insignia in military service. The moment created exactly the kind of visibility Sarah would normally avoid, but today she welcomed it. Johnson looked up from his equipment inspection, his eyes widening as he recognized the face beneath the confident exterior and elite military bearing. For a moment, his expression showed pure confusion, as if his brain couldn't process the contradiction between his memories and current reality. "That can't be," he started to say, but his voice trailed off as recognition fully set in. Sarah decided to end his confusion. She walked directly toward the group of Marines, her approach deliberate and purposeful. The gymnasium seemed to grow quieter as other personnel sensed that something significant was about to unfold. "Sergeant Johnson," she said, her voice carrying the authority and confidence that SEAL training had embedded in her core. "It's been a while." Johnson stared at her, his mouth opening and closing without producing words. The man who had once commanded the situation through intimidation and mockery now looked like a deer caught in headlights. The other Marines gathered around him showed similar expressions of shock and disbelief. "Martinez," Williams finally managed to ask, "is that really you?" Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. It was the smile of someone who had traveled a long road to reach this moment and intended to savor every second of it. "Petty Officer First Class Martinez," she corrected gently. "But yes, it's me. The princess you all found so amusing." The word princess hung in the air like a physical presence, carrying with it all the cruelty and mockery of that day 2 years earlier. But now it sounded different coming from her lips, transformed from an insult into a reminder of just how wrong they had been about her potential. A crowd was beginning to form as other personnel realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Word spread quickly through the gymnasium that a Navy SEAL was confronting Marines who had apparently underestimated her in the past. The story was too compelling for people to ignore. "I remember what you told me," Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly to the growing audience. "You said I should find a nice desk job somewhere safe and comfortable. You said I should leave the real work to real warriors." Johnson's face had gone pale. The confident bully who had once dominated through verbal cruelty now looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. He understood that this moment was being witnessed by dozens of military personnel and that his reputation was about to suffer irreparable damage. "Look, Martinez, Petty Officer, we were just—" He started to stammer. "No, sarà interrupted firmly. You weren't just anything. You made a deliberate choice to humiliate someone who was trying to serve her country. You used your rank and position to break down someone who was already struggling. You enjoyed it." The gymnasium had grown almost completely silent except for Sarah's voice. Even ongoing training exercises had paused as personnel stopped to witness this confrontation between elite special operations and conventional forces. Williams tried to step in, perhaps hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated further. "We were wrong," he said quietly. "We were completely wrong about you. What you've accomplished is incredible." Sarah turned her attention to him, her expression showing no forgiveness or acceptance of his attempt at reconciliation. "You were wrong about what I could become, but you were absolutely right about who I was at that moment. I was weak, unprepared, and emotionally vulnerable. I did cry when you attacked me." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "But here's what you didn't understand then, and probably don't understand now. Crying doesn't make someone weak. Giving up makes someone weak. And I never gave up." Master Chief Rodriguez appeared at Sarah's shoulder, having noticed the commotion and moved to investigate. His presence added another layer of authority to the situation, representing not just Sarah's current command structure, but the entire SEAL community. "Is there a problem here, Petty Officer Martinez?" Rodriguez asked, his tone professional but clearly protective of his subordinate. "No problem, Master Chief," Sarah replied without taking her eyes off Johnson. "I was just catching up with some old friends who helped motivate me during my early military career." Rodriguez studied the Marines with the kind of cold assessment that made grown men reconsider their life choices. He had heard Sarah's story during her training, and he understood exactly what was happening in this moment. "Gentlemen," Rodriguez said to the Marines, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through decades of elite military service. "You're looking at one of the finest operators I've had the privilege to train. Petty Officer Martinez graduated at the top of her SEAL class and has already distinguished herself in operational assignments." The words hit Johnson like physical blows. Each commendation of Sarah's achievements served as a reminder of just how completely he had misjudged her potential. "I want you all to understand something," Sarah said, addressing not just the Marines, but the entire audience that had gathered to witness this confrontation. "This isn't about revenge. This isn't about proving anyone wrong. This is about what happens when someone tells you that you can't achieve your dreams." She gestured toward her SEAL trident, the symbol that represented the pinnacle of military achievement. "You can accept their judgment and live with their limitations, or you can use their doubt as motivation to exceed what they thought was possible." Johnson finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "We were sorry. We were wrong about you." Sarah studied him for a long moment, considering whether his apology carried genuine remorse or was simply damage control in front of a military audience. Either way, his words no longer held any power over her. "Your apology is noted," she said finally. "But it's not necessary. You gave me exactly what I needed, even though you didn't mean to. You showed me what I was capable of becoming when someone told me I couldn't." She turned to address the wider audience, using this moment as a teaching opportunity for the younger military personnel who were witnessing this exchange. Every person in this room will face moments when someone tells them they're not good enough, not strong enough, not capable enough to achieve their goals. You can let those moments define your limitations, or you can let them define your motivation. The gymnasium erupted in spontaneous applause, led by Rodriguez, but quickly joined by personnel from every branch of service present. The sound was thunderous, representing recognition not just of Sarah's individual achievement, but of the principle she represented. As the applause died down, Sarah turned back to Johnson one final time. The man who had once loomed over her like a giant now seemed small and diminished, his authority undermined by the obvious respect she commanded from everyone present. "Thank you," she said simply, "for showing me what I was capable of becoming." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the Marines to process what they had just experienced. The conversation around them would continue for hours, with dozens of witnesses eager to share the story of what they had seen. But Sarah was already focused on her next mission, her next challenge, her next opportunity to exceed expectations. The woman who had once cried under the cruel laughter of bullies had transformed into someone who inspired others to pursue their own version of excellence. The princess was dead. The warrior who had taken her place was just getting started. As she walked out of that gymnasium for the second time in 2 years, Sarah realized that this confrontation had served a purpose beyond personal vindication. It had demonstrated to everyone present that limitations are often illusions, that potential can be hidden beneath apparent weakness, and that the most dangerous opponent is sometimes the one everyone underestimates. The Marines had learned that lesson the hard way. They had mocked a princess and created a predator. They had tried to break someone and instead forged them into something unbreakable. Most importantly, they had proven that sometimes the cruelest gift someone can give you is telling you that you're not good enough to achieve your dreams. Because for some people, that kind of doubt becomes the fuel that transforms the impossible into the inevitable. Sarah Martinez had become living proof of that transformation, and her story would inspire others long after the echoes of cruel laughter had faded into memory.